Living with the light, and today we're going to talk about Netilas Yadayim, washing hands, and if we were to continue, if we were to pretend that we're following some kind of order here, then we went from Friday night to Saturday night to Kiddush Levana after Shabbos, and now it's the morning again. It's Sunday morning, and you're going to wash your hands when you wake up, what we often call Nagelwasser, but the Netilas Yadayim in the morning. But I decided that if I'm going to talk about Netilas Yadayim in the morning, I should also talk about Netilas Yadayim before we eat bread. Now, not that they really have anything to do with each other, which is part of why I want to talk about both, because they have the same blessing, they have the same bracha, but they, for the most part, are completely unrelated to each other in terms of their origin and their reasons. And so I thought it would make sense to try within our time frame to discuss both. We'll see if we get to both. And actually, I wanted to start with Netilas Yadayim on bread before bread, um, for certain reasons that I thought it made sense to start there. So before we eat bread, we wash our hands and we recite a blessing of Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu al netilas yadayim, that God sanctified us with His commandments, and commanded us to on netilas yadayim. Pause there for a moment and ask, what does netilas yadayim even mean? The word netila does not mean to wash. If we wanted to say on washing our hands, we would say on rechitzas yadayim. Rechitza would be washing. Netila means like raising up or taking. We actually say al netilas lulav. When we shake a lulav, we say on the taking of a lulav. So it's about the taking of our hands. So that's something that we'll have to try to explain. Why is the blessing on washing our hands al netilas yadayim? And even though we make a blessing asher kiddushan mitzvosav, that God commanded us with His mitzvos and commanded us to wash our hands, we'll note that the obligation to wash our hands before bread is not a biblical commandment. It is a rabbinic commandment. But even on rabbinic commandments, we say asher kiddushan mitzvosav, that God sanctified us with His commandments. For example, when we light the Hanukkah menorah, we have the same blessing. And we say that God commanded us, even though you will not find anywhere in the Torah that God commanded us to light the menorah on Hanukkah, because that was enacted many years later by the sages. But yet we say that God commanded us. And really, the Gemara asks this question: why? How could we say, where were we commanded? And the Gemara says that we were commanded when the Torah says that we must listen to the sages. And since that, the Torah does say, it does say to listen to the sages. So if the sages enact a mitzvah, then we are therefore commanded to listen to them. So we are commanded to do their mitzvah. So that's where we're commanded to light the Hanukkah candles, and that's where we're commanded to wash our hands, because the sages have enacted that we should wash our hands before bread. And the question is why? Why are we supposed to wash our hands before we eat bread? And it has actually quite an interesting history to it. So the Gemara tells us in Maseches Shabbos, in Tractate Shabbos, that the students of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the academies of Hillel and Shammai, decreed that that hands would be considered impure and need to be washed. And the question is with regards to what, and the question is why, and with regards to what. So there is a back and forth in the Gemara, and I did include this on the source sheet. So it's a Gemara in Shabbos 14b to 15a. The Gemara first asks about the veracity of that statement, that it was the disciples of Shammai and Hillel who enacted that the hands would be impure and require washing. And the Gemara asks, was it really them? Wasn't it Shammai and Hillel themselves, the sages, the elders, Shammai and Hillel themselves, not their students who enacted this? And the Gemara brings a proof to that. And then the Gemara says that actually what happened is Shammai and Hillel themselves originally issued a decree that hands should be considered impure and require washing. We haven't yet noted for what, but require washing for something. And says the Gemara, it was not accepted when they originally made that decree, but their disciples came and issued a decree, and it was accepted, and that's how it became part of our laws. Is that it was decreed by their disciples. But the Gemara is not done there, and the Gemara then asks, "Vakati Shlomo Gazar," but still, was it not issued by King Solomon, by Shlomo, that hands would be considered impure? And the Gemara quotes a tradition. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, "B'shashtik and Shlomo eruvin Netilas Yadayim." At the time that Shlomo, King Solomon, instituted the laws of eruv, certain laws relating to eruv and washing hands. At that time, a baskol, a divine voice, came out and it said, "Bini, my son, im chacham libecha yismach libi gamani." If your heart is wise, my heart will be glad, even mine. And another verse from Proverbs, "Chacham b'ni v'samach libi v'ashiva charfi davar." My son, be wise and make my heart glad. So apparently these are verses that express approval, and they were said regarding Shlomo's enactments, but that's not really our focus. The point is that in this tradition, in this statement of Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Shlomo, King Solomon, enacted that you must wash your hands because they're impure. And again, we didn't say yet what you're washing them for, when you're washing them, but for something. So we seem to have a contradiction. On the one hand, we're saying that it was the students of Shammai and Hillel who enacted that hands would be considered impure and require washing. And on the other hand, it sounds like it was King Shlomo. To which the Gemara concludes that it's not a contradiction. It was different things. Came Solomon, King Shlomo, and decree impurity on hands to prohibit contact with consecrated items, what we'll call kadshim. And Shammai and Hillel and their disciples came and decree impurity even to prohibit contact with teruma. What is kadshim and what is truma? So kadshim usually refers to offerings. So sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, in the temple. So Shlomo HaMelech said that before anyone touches kadshim, a person, let's say, brings an offering, they bring a karban, certain types of karbanos, you got to eat the meat from. The Kohanim got a share. Some parts went on the altar, on the Mizbeach, and the owner of the karban ate a portion of it too. So Shlomo decreed that before you put your hands on that meat, you must wash them. That was Shlomo's decree. That was specifically to eating kadshim, eating sacrifices. Then later, Shammai and Hillel came and said that we're going to issue the same kind of decree with regards to truma. What is truma? Truma is the part of one's produce that one separates to give to a Kohen. And it's only allowed to be eaten by Kohanim, by the priestly clan, and that's it. And it's very holy, and before anybody touches truma, they must wash their hands. And that's where it stood for some time. And really, based on that, we would not be washing our hands yet for our bread, because our bread is not truma, nor is it an animal offering. So Shlomo decreed that one should wash their hands. The hands would be considered impure until one washes them when it came to eating kadshim, sacrifices. And then later, the sages, Shammai and Hillel, and their students enacted that we should treat truma in the same way, and one may not eat truma until they wash their hands. Why? Why are they making such an enactment? So the Gemara actually tells us, I didn't include it on the source sheet, but it's one page back there in Masechah Shabbos, and the Gemara says, because Yadayim askani osein, because hands are busy, and they touch things, and therefore you should wash them before you eat. Okay, what does that mean? What are we concerned about? What are we concerned that they may have touched, that you need to wash them before you eat from an offering? So there seem to be two possibilities. One is maybe they touched something impure. and now the person is tame, and so we have them wash their hands because they're tame. The problem with that is that if the person was really tame, then washing their hands wouldn't be enough. A person who's really tame has to go through a process of purification, depending on what type of tuma, what type of ritual impurity they have. But there's a process of purification that it certainly involves going to a mikvah and may also involve ashes of the red heifer, the paraduma. It's much more complicated than just washing your hands. So if that was the concern, then it doesn't seem that washing hands would do the trick. So Rashi says it can't be that that was the concern. It must be the concern is simply that maybe you touch something unclean, something dirty, your hands, something disgusting, whatever it might be, and it's just not proper kavod, not proper respect for a karban to then touch the karban, to touch the offering without having washed your hands after they touch something dirty, something impure. So So therefore, Shlomo enacted before anybody touches kachim, holy offerings, they have to wash their hands of anything unclean that they might have touched. And along came Hillel and Shammai later and said, we're going to say the same thing about Truma because Truma is also holy, and we want to extend it to that as well. Now, just to go back to the other possibility, again, Rashi is saying it's because maybe we touch something dirty and it's not respectful to touch a karban or to touch truma after having touched something dirty. The other possibility was that maybe we're afraid that somebody might touch something impure, ritually impure, become tame. So it's possible to argue that that really is the concern. Really, the concern is that somebody would touch something impure. And therefore, they required that we wash our hands before we touch truma or we touch kachim, we touch offerings, just as a reminder to be careful with what we do with our hands and to make sure that we don't touch something impure. In other words, maybe the real concern is that we would touch something impure and become tameh. By washing our hands, we're not solving that problem. If we actually touch something impure, washing hands won't solve the problem. But a requirement to wash hands before one eats or touches offerings or touches truma may serve as a reminder to be extra careful not to allow those hands to become impure in the first place. So I think both are possibilities. The concern is either that our hands actually touch something dirty and it's not respectful for the offerings or the truma to then go ahead and touch them without washing them first, or alternatively, by requiring us to wash our hands before eating from these things or touching these things, these holy items, it's a reminder to always be careful with where we place our hands, and that way we won't become impure before we partake of these holy items, offerings, and truma. So if that was it, then it wouldn't really be relevant to us because we are not eating from offerings these days, unfortunately, and we also are not eating truma these days. So, and if you weren't a Kohen, well, I guess it could be, yeah, if you're generally not contacting truma too much anyways. So why are we washing our hands nowadays before every time we eat bread? So this brings us to a Gemara in Chulin, which is the next source on the page. The Gemara says in Chulin, Amar Ravidi bar Avan Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Ashiyan, Netilas Yadayim lechulin mipnei srach truma. That which we wash our hands even for chulin, which means like the mundane, for basic bread that we eat, it's there. Here they translate as an ancillary decree on account of truma. It's basically means so that we don't get mixed up when it would come to eating truma. So let's bring ourselves back to those days. So there's been an enactment that anybody who's going to come in contact with truma has to wash their hands. So the sages ordained that not only for eating truma must you wash your hands, but we're going to have it that everybody who eats bread should wash their hands to make sure that everybody who eats truma washes their hands. So it's a kind of a protection around around eating truma to ensure that everybody washes their hands for truma. The requirement was made that everybody should wash their hands for any time that they eat bread. Now, why just bread? Shouldn't it be, more than bread? So first of all, according to most opinions, truma by Torah law only applies to either bread or not bread, I should say wheat products, produce from grain such as wheat or barley, or products of wine or oil, like olive oil. And olive oil and wine, you're usually not touching with your hands anyways. So those are liquids. We're not really concerned you'll touch it directly with your hands. We don't need a decree there. We only need it by something that could be truma by Torah law, which is basically the five grains, something from a grain product. And so technically it could maybe apply to cookies and cakes, but they made it on bread. Bread is like the staple that specifically by bread one must wash their hands, and it's on account of the requirement to wash one's hands for real truma. We also everybody in solidarity almost with the Kohanim who are washing their hands for truma. Everybody washes their hands for bread. And even though nowadays it doesn't seem relevant anymore because we don't have truma anymore, so nobody has to wash their hands for truma, the commentaries explain, the Mishnah Berurah brings it down, that we are hopeful that Meheira Yibana Beis Hamikdash, that shortly and quickly the Beis Hamikdash, the temple, should be rebuilt. And so they never nullified this obligation to wash hands for truma and to wash hands for bread, because any day we're hopeful that we'll be back in that in that place, in that position where people will be eating truma again and washing their hands for truma, and therefore we will continue to wash our hands for bread, um, so that we're ready and for when we have the Beis Hamikdash again, and we are once again eating from truma. Now the Gemara doesn't end there though. The Gemara then makes another statement, and if you're still on the source sheet, the second source, Chulin 106a, it says, and the obligation is further due to its being a mitzvah. The od mishum mitzvah, it says, also because it's a mitzvah to wash your hands. What does that mean? The Gemara wants to know that. What mitzvah does it involve? Abaye says, mitzvah lishma divrei chachamim. It's a mitzvah to listen to the statements of the sages. Okay, so we said the sages enacted that one should wash their hands, that we don't get confused with truma. We continue to wash our hands for truma, so we should wash our hands for all bread. And also, it's a mitzvah to listen to the sages. Well, that seems to be like double dipping on the same thing. So this is a question that concerns the commentaries. And Tosfos says, no, there's another issue here. Cleanliness, just cleanliness in general. The sages wanted one to wash their hands because of cleanliness as well. That's what it means. And and just general good hygiene has it that we wash our hands before a meal, a prominent meal, and that's why we're supposed to. That's another reason to wash our hands, which is certainly the case. The question is that what the Gemara intended? That's what Tosfos thinks the Gemara intended. Later commentaries try to give kind of a historical answer to this statement, and so in a work called "The Beis Mordechai," which was written by Mordechai Vogelman, he was a rabbi in Poland before moving to Eretz Yisrael, before moving to Israel, where he was then a rabbi in a little town up north. He was also the uncle of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, former chief rabbi of Israel. And if you read Rabbi Lau's biography called Out of the Depths, he talks a lot about his uncle, who he lived with for a while after the Holocaust, when he came to Israel. So Rabbi Vogelman suggests that if you understand what was going on at that time, in the times of basically post the first temple, post the first Beis Hamikdash, Christianity is being built up, and they were stripping the Judaism of many of its laws, and in particular them and also the Tzidukim, the Sadducees, before the destruction of the temple, and after those who carry on their approach. So they were after generally rabbinic laws, And in particular, he says laws relating to purity and impurity, in particular, Netilas Yadayim, washing hands. And therefore, the Gemara kind of, particularly here, makes an emphasis that there's a mitzvah to listen to the words of the sages, and even though there are those who are attacking and and degrading these types of mitzvahs, these rabbinic commandments, in particular hand washing, there's a mitzvah to listen to the chachamim, to listen to the sages, and it should be continued to be kept. And the Marat Chayus, or Tzvi Hirsch Chayus, also has a similar idea in a work of his where he says that he mentions in particular the Christians attacked the mitzvah of Netilas Yadayim. He has some quote from one of from somewhere that the early Christians were specifically not washing their hands, and they had a justification of why, and so there's a historical factor over here as well. When the Gemara says mitzvah lishma divrei chacham, another reason is there's a commandment to listen to the words of the sages. That is it doesn't say that by other rabbinic enactments. It's emphasized here because this was a mitzvah of the sages, a commandment of the sages that was, for some reason, particularly under attack, and and therefore there's an emphasis put here that just do it because there's a mitzvah to listen to the sages. Okay, now there is another mention of washing hands for bread, one other place, and that is in a Gemara in Brachos, and it's based on a pasuk, a verse in Parsha Shmini, and it's the top of the second page of the source sheet if you have it. It's in Vayikra chapter 11, Parak Yud Aleph, where it says, Ki ani Hashem Elokeichem, I am the Lord your God, v'yiskadishtem, and you shall sanctify yourselves, v'yisem kedoshim, and you shall be holy. And the Gemara comments in Brachos on that. It says, the Amar of Yehuda Amar Rav, Yehuda saying the name of Rav, and some say it was Brisa, on the words v'hiskadishtem, and you shall sanctify yourselves. That means Mayim Rishonim, washing before the meal. V'yisem kedoshim, and you shall be holy. Elo Mayim Achronim, that refers to washing after the meal. So there's a verse. Now the Ksava Kabbalah, Tzvi Hirsch, Yaakov C. Mecklenburg notes that the context of this verse is all around dietary laws. Parsha Shmini has all the laws of kosher food, and non-kosher food has to do with eating. And in that context, it says, basically mostly after listing most of the laws, it says, and you shall sanctify yourselves. And actually the end of this verse, the same verse says, and do not defile yourselves through any creeping creatures that crawls on the ground, meaning by eating from certain things. So this verse is in the context of what one is allowed to eat and what one is not allowed to eat. And it seems that says the Ksava Kabbalah, that's what's prompting the Gemara to attribute it to something to do with meals. V'yiskadishtem, you should sanctify yourself. What does that mean? It means, says the Gemara, to wash your hands before the meal. V'yisem kedoshim, and you shall be holy. The next words is washing your hands after the meal. Mayim achronim, washing waters for after the meal. So here's another mention of washing hands before the meal. It's a different source. It's not saying it's srach truma, that it's has to do with remembering making sure everybody washes their hands before truma, so everybody has to wash their hands before bread. This seems to be, just in a more general sense, to sanctify our hands before we eat. Now, some understand, again, that it's about cleanliness, it's about hygiene, that you should be clean before, and cleanliness associated with holiness, and you should be clean before you eat. But Mecklenburg in Ksava Kabbalah has another maybe deeper and more perhaps meaningful understanding. So he says that we actually have a term for the washing that the Kohanim would do to prepare themselves for the service in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, and in the Beis Hamikdash. They would wash their hands from the kior, from the basin that was in the Beis Hamikdash. And the term that the sages used to refer to is Kiddush Yadayim V'Raglayim, the sanctification of hands and feet. They wash their feet too. It's Kiddush, it's called sanctification. So washing hands in that context is called sanctifying the hands. So he says, just like the sages, just like they refer to washing hands in preparation for service in the Beis Hamikdash, they call it kiddush, sanctification. So too, washing hands for food is also called sanctification. That's what we see from this verse, the way the sages, the Gemara is interpreting the verse, V'yiskadishtem, and you should sanctify yourselves. How do you sanctify yourselves? With washing hands. So they're calling washing hands sanctifying oneself. And and so first of all, one has to understand that a person is coming to eat a meal. They're eating from Hashem's food. They're eating from food that was provided by God, and so one has to sanctify themselves before such an experience. And he explains, though, that the idea of kedusha, of holiness, of sanctification, he says it means hisalus visromamus, which means like elevating it. It's elevating it. It's making it lofty, making it holy. He brings examples of this, and he says that's why we call this Netilas Yadayim, because we asked at the beginning, why do we call it Netilas Yadayim? Why is the blessing Netilas Yadayim? Netilas Yadayim means to take your hands. So one of the early commentaries, the Rush, has a very interesting suggestion for why it's called Netilas Yadayim. He says because you do it with a cup, and a cup in Aramaic is called a natla. So natla, netila, that's why we call it Netilas Yadayim. That's what the Rush says, Rabbeinu Asher. But Rav Mecklenburg here in Haksam Bakabal, he says no. Netilas Yadayim means to take your hands, to raise your hands, to lift up your hands. In fact, some have the custom to raise up their hands when they wash. And and there's a message in that. There's a lesson in that. We're elevating our hands when we wash them. We are sanctifying them. We're making them holy, so to speak, before we engage in eating. And and the idea he suggests is that the Gemara tells us that before we eat, we make a bracha. We're not talking about washing hands, just a blessing on the food. The reason, or one of the reasons the Gemara says, is because if one does not make a bracha, so it's almost like they're stealing from God. That's the term is me'ila. Me'ila is misappropriating something holy. This food belongs to God, as the verse says, "LaHashem haaretz u'meloa," that God owns everything in the world. On the other hand, we have another verse that says, "V'haaretz nasan livnei adam," that God gave the land to man. So there's a contradiction. It says the whole world belongs to God. LaHashem haaretz u'meloa. The land belongs to God. On the other hand, it says, and God gave it to man. So the Gemara says, well, one is before you make the blessing, and one is after. That through blessing God, thanking God for the food, we are able to acquire it. So before we make the blessing, it belongs to God. And if it belongs to God, it's hektish, it's sanctified. It's like it belongs to the temple almost. It's not ours. It's holy still. And after we make a blessing, so then we acquire it, then it becomes ours. So therefore, there's actually now a greater connection between the bread that we eat and the truma that we began with. Because we said truma, and going back all the way to kachim, to the karbanos. Shlomo, King Solomon enacted, you have to wash your hands before you eat from an offering. It's holy meat. And along came Hillel and Shammai, the elders and their students, and said, well, truma is also holy. You have to wash your hands before you eat truma as well. says Rav Mecklenburg, when they then enacted that you should wash your hands for any bread, it was with the recognition that any bread is really, in a certain sense, kodesh. It's holy. It's before we make the blessing on it. When we first take our bread, it's it's belongs to God. Until you make the blessing on it, you haven't brought it into our domain yet. Hashem everything belongs to God until you make the blessing. And so even the bread, even mundane bread, chulin, regular bread, is in the domain of hektish, of holy bread, until you make the blessing. And therefore, just like they enacted you should wash your hands for truma, so you should wash your hands for regular bread too, because regular bread is sanctified as well. It's property of hektish until you make a blessing momentarily. But before you do that, you're going to be picking up the bread. You have to wash your hands before. So so in order to um, and and since we're going to be interacting, we're going to be touching something holy, something that's in the domain of God. So before we do that, we have to elevate our hands. We have to make our hands holy. And that's the process of washing hands. Netilas Yadayim, raising up the hands. V'hiskadishtem, you should sanctify them. You should elevate them because you're about to pick up something that's in God's domain until we make a blessing on it and bring it into our domain. So this is the approach of Reb Mecklenburg that kind of bridges the all these different concepts together. So again, on a simple level, we're washing our hands just to almost in solidarity, or so that we don't get confused, so that we keep an understanding that you have to wash your hands for truma, and so everybody washes their hands for all bread. But Reb Mecklenburg, the Ksava Kabbalah, is saying it's more than that. It's a matter of viewing our bread almost like truma itself, because until we make a blessing, it's still in the domain of God, and therefore it's like hektish, it's like sanctified, and therefore we should wash our hands before it. And washing hands, he also notes, is v'hiskadishtem, as the Gemara says, it's kiddush, it's elevating it, it's making your hands holy before you touch something holy. So and that's the blessing of Netilas Yadayim, of raising up your hands, lifting your hands, taking your hands, and elevating them in order to partake of our bread. Okay, so that is Netilas Yadayim for bread. What about Netilas Yadayim, washing hands when we wake up in the morning? So, as I said, one seemingly has nothing to do with the other, except that they have the same blessing. And the reason why they have the same blessing, the Rush says, is because it's easy that way. It's simple that way to have the same blessing. Both involve hand washing, so it keeps it simple to have the same blessing. Robert.
My understanding is that actually you have to wash your hands if you've slept for a long time, even during the day. It's most commonly in the morning, but it could be at other times.
Okay, so that's part of the question, really. Will you have to wash your hands if you slept during the day? So let's go step by step in the time we have. Back to a Gemara. So the Gemara says in Brachos, Ve'amar Rabbi Yochanan said, Harotze sheyikabel olav ol malchus shamayim shlema. One who seeks to accept upon themselves the complete yoke of the kingdom of heaven. So it's talking about when you wake up. So you should relieve yourself. He should wash his hands, put on his tefillin, recite Shema, and pray. That is considered the complete acceptance of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, and then it says that anyone who does this, it's as if he built an altar and offered a sacrifice upon it. And it quotes a verse in Tehillim, Erchatz b'nikayom kapai, I will wash in purity my hands. Vasovas mizbach Hashem, I will encircle the altar of the Lord. Which implies that before you circle the altar, meaning before you are engaged in avoda, in service of God, you should wash your hands. Okay, we're not going to go into every line of this, but here's one mention already of washing hands before engaging in service of God and davening. So this is one source. Then later in Maseches Brachos, in Tractate Brachos, the Gemara says very explicitly, when one awakens, here's the order of the day. When one wakes up, they say first, Elokai neshama shnasata bi, Torah. They say the blessing of Elokai neshama, that God has returned my soul. It says other things there. I'll just note that we're not dealing with practical application of these halachos because halacha goes through a process. The Gemara says it one way, but then there's a process of how it actually is filtered or funneled through to how we actually practice. Although we might touch briefly on some with regards to washing hands. But then it says kimashi yade, when one washes their hands, lema, they should say Baruch Asher Kiddushanu Tzivanu al Netilas Yadayim. So in the morning, when one washes their hands, they should say al Netilas Yadayim. Now the Gemara here makes no mention of why you're washing your hands. If you go back to the first Gemara, there's maybe a hint. It says, "I wash my hands in purity and I encircled the altar of the Lord." It's a precursor to service, to encircling the altar, whatever that is exactly. But it's a lead up to doing avoda, to doing service of God. Okay, then, so let's pause for a second. I think that if we would ask most people why you wash your hands in the morning, they would say because you're tameh when you wake up, you're impure. There's some kind of what we call ruach ra, evil spirit, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that. But I would say that's not necessarily the main reason, although it's certainly relevant. Let's actually let's discuss that now. So there's another Gemara in Shabbos. Yes, Chaim Miriam.
Thank you, Rabbi. So when you first wake up in the morning and you say the Mudani, you don't wash hand before this prayer.
Right.
You wash hand and you do the other one. So will it be because you don't say the name of God? That's why you don't have to wash hand?
Exactly. That's why we are choosing. That's why we don't have the name of God in that prayer. It would seem. Yeah. Okay, so the Gemara says in Shabbos, the Gemara says, Hu haya omer, Rabbi Mona used to say, Yad la'ayin, a hand that touches the eye, tikatzitz, should be severed. Yad la'chotem, tikatzitz. If it touches the nose, it should be severed. Yad la'pet, tikatzitz, a hand that touches the mouth should be severed, etc., etc., etc. Jumping to the end. So basically it's saying the hand shouldn't touch all different parts of the body. And then it says, Tanya, Rabbi Natsan Taring Abraisa, Bas Chorinhi, Umakpedes Achir Chotiadav Shalosh Pamim. She is a liberated entity, this evil spirit that rests on one's hands before they are washed in the morning, and she refuses to leave until one washes his hands 3 times. So it's actually a Gemara. You know, sometimes these types of things don't appear in the Talmud, sometimes they do. That references that there's some kind of spirit upon us when we wake up in the morning, and until we wash our hands 3 times, that spirit doesn't go away, and we have to be careful about what we touch before that before we wash our hands. That's the Gemara. So okay, so we have when we wake up in the morning, we're supposed to wash our hands and make a bracha. We also have that there's some kind of spirit that's upon us when we wake up, and we have to wash our hands 3 times to get rid of it. So is that the only reason why we're washing our hands in the morning? So the answer is no. And as for why we wash our hands in the morning, the Rishonim, the early commentaries, have 2 main approaches. One is the approach of the Rush, Rabbeinu Asher, and one is the approach of the Rashba. The Rush writes in his commentary on Brachos that the reason one washes their hands in the morning is because, similar to what we said before with regards to washing for bread, Yadayim askan yosein, hands are busy, they touch things. While a person's sleeping, who knows where their hands touched on their body? and uh, and they might have touched a place that's unclean, impure, and so one has to wash their hands to clean them in the morning before one davens, before one they have to make sure their hands are clean. And so according to the Rush, the reason why we wash our hands in the morning is to prepare ourselves for davening. They might be dirty, they might have touched something, and in order to prepare ourselves for davening, we need to wash our hands. And that fits well with the verse that we quoted before. I will wash my hands and then I'll circle the altar, meaning before I do service of God, before I daven, before I pray, I have to wash my hands. That's the Rush. Why doesn't he just say it's because our of this evil spirit that it's a Gemara? The Gemara says there's a spirit upon us. Why doesn't he say that? So the commentaries explain because if we were just worried about a spirit that's apparently dangerous for us to touch our body parts, we wouldn't make a bracha on that. That wouldn't deserve a blessing. Um, it's a protective measure, but we wouldn't make a blessing on it. The fact that the Gemara says to make a blessing implies that there's something more, not just a protection from a spirit. There's something spiritual. There's something elevating here. And so the Rosh says it's preparation for tefillah. It's preparation for davening. That's why we're washing. The Rashba has a completely different idea. And the Rashba says that the reason we wash our hands in the morning is because in the morning we're like a new creation. And we need to thank God for creating us anew and declare that we're ready to serve Him. And so we wash our hands just like a Kohen would wash his hands in preparation for serving in the Mishkan. So every morning we wash our hands in preparation for serving God in our world, our Mishkan, our tabernacle, our temple, which is the whole world for us. So very different idea. The washing our hands, it's not in specific preparation for tefillah. It's not in preparation for anything specific. It's every morning we're like a new creation and we're ready to serve God anew. And just like a Kohen in the temple would wash his hands, so too we wash our hands in preparation for the day. There's a lot of practical differences between these two answers, these two explanations. If it's preparation for davening, or if it's preparation, or it's because you're a new creation when the new day comes. Let's say a person stayed up all night, so they're not waking up anew. They're not like a new creation necessarily. Um, or maybe you could argue that they are. Every day, is a new day, even if they didn't go to sleep. Um, you can say that if you stayed up, then you don't have to worry that maybe you touched something, because that concern was while one's sleeping, we're concerned the person may have touched something, um, and therefore needs to wash their hands in preparation to pray. But if they were awake, then maybe they know that they didn't touch something. And then you have this third issue of ruach ra, of the evil spirit that we need to wash away. So the idea of washing 3 times certainly is for the ruach ra, for that evil spirit mentioned in the Gemara. The Zohar actually, not surprisingly, also refers to a spirit that comes upon a person. The Zohar actually explains it a little bit. The Zohar says that it says, why do we get this ruach ra, this spirit upon us? It says because when a person is sleeping, their neshama goes up and it leaves us. And when the neshama leaves us, just like when a person dies, there's impurity that enters the body. So too, just when a person goes to sleep, some level of impurity enters the body, and when it comes back, um, most of it goes away, um, but there's still something that remains, and that's what we have to wash our hands to get rid of. That's what the Zohar says. So, but in terms of the kind of the practical halacha, that again wouldn't warrant a blessing apparently, and so we will only make a blessing if the other reasons are relevant. And actually, we would need both reasons to be relevant in order to make a blessing, because we would be unsure. If so, for example, um, if a person stayed up all night, so it's not so clear if one should make a blessing. Um, like we said, maybe since you never went to sleep, you're not like a new creation. On the other hand, maybe the rabbis enacted that every morning you should make a blessing either way. But if the reason is because maybe we touched something, then if we were up all night, then we don't really have that concern. And so generally, when somebody stays up all night, then they should not make the blessing of Al Netilas Yadayim unless they know that their hands got dirty. Um, so if a person goes to the bathroom, they can know that their hands got dirty, and then they could wash their hands and make the blessing. Let's say a person sleeps only part of the night. They wake up in the middle of the night, but they're done sleeping. They sorry, they wake up they wake up in the middle of the night. They wash their hands, and then then morning strikes hours later. So you wake up at 3 a.m. So you woke up, wash your hands, and now it's the morning though. It's 5 hours later. It's 8 a.m. Should you wash your hands again? Because according to the idea that when it's a new day, you should wash your hands, then it would seem that it would make sense to wash your hands again. But it wouldn't merit a blessing at that point because I think you would have already made the blessing earlier when you woke up the first time. So these are just some. There's more practical differences, but in terms of why we wash our hands in the morning, it's as you've seen, it's very different than washing our hands for bread. It really has nothing to do with it. It's the same blessing just to keep things consistent. But the washing hands that we do in the morning is either because we have to prepare for tefillah, we may have touched something overnight, and so to daven in order to pray, we need to make sure our hands are clean, or it's because when we wake up in the morning, we're like a new creation, and we need to dedicate ourselves anew to serving Hashem, just like a Kohen would each day in the temple. Or, and additionally, an additional reason is also because of this Ruach Ra, this spirit that's upon us, that when we go to sleep, our neshama leaves us. So when it comes back, there's still some impurity that remains, and apparently the solution for that is washing hands 3 times to solve that. Okay, we will hold there.